After a long break in F1 fantasy, we finally returned to the grid in Austin, Texas. So, who should we be buying, selling, and holding ahead of the next Grand Prix? Let's find out. What is up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of F1 Fantasy Pole Position. It is Monday, October 14th. My name is Ewan. On today's episode, I'm going to go over the green flag, yellow flag, red flag show for the United States Grand Prix in Austin, Texas, in COTA, whatever you want to call it. We are returning to the F1 grid. It has been a long break, and I am very much ready to get back into F1 fantasy. I put out some content over the fall break, had an interview, had a chip strategy episode, and had some early team selections. So if you want to go watch that, if you're still fiending for some F1 fantasy content, you can go check that out on my channel. You can like this video, subscribe to the channel, all that fun stuff. Follow me on X at F1UandFPL. But let's just get right back into it here with a quick report card from Singapore. I had Piastri, Hamilton, Ferrari, Magnussen, and Alexander Albon in my last episode of green flag, yellow flag, red flag. It went okay. Piastri, 26 points, went up 0.1 million. His first race as an A-tier asset. So I'm going to give myself a B right there. Hamilton, I gave him the red flag, 17 points, went up 0.3 million. So he is now an A-tier driver heading into the United States Grand Prix as well. Gave myself a B- there. So while I said sell him, I think it worked out because it just didn't really go well for Mercedes the entire weekend. Like George Russell lost some places. Lewis Hamilton started like way down the grid. So while it was still like a positive weekend overall with 17 points and a 0.3 bump, I still think it was the right call to sell Lewis Hamilton going into Singapore. Ferrari, I gave myself the green flag for that. A-, 49 points, 0.3 million. They were kind of like the opposite of Mercedes. Like they were kind of having a rough Saturday, and then they gained all the places back on Sunday for a good weekend overall. And they're going to be one of the teams that we are watching heading into the United States Grand Prix here. Kevin Magnussen, I gave a green flag, -1 points, went down 0.2 million. That's a straight up F. Did not go well for K-Mag at all that weekend. And Alexander Albon, yellow flag, -16 because of his DNF, 0.2 million. He went down. B+ because I was kind of like, I don't know how it's going to go down in Singapore. And yeah, that's kind of how it happened. He just did not have a good Sunday. Williams reliability. He now has a grid leading 4 DNFs on the season. So Alexander Albon coming under a little bit of pressure from his teammate, Franco Colapinto, and is now kind of falling back in F1 fantasy. So that was my report card for the Singapore Grand Prix. Let me know in the comments below what you think about the grades I give myself for my calls for the last Grand Prix. Going over here, we're going to have a couple of repeats this week in green flag, yellow flag, red flag, just because it is an important time in F1 fantasy. I don't want to like gloss over the really important points that are here in our final 6 races of the 2024 season. So Oscar Piastri comes in here, 25.3 million on the season, 24.7 points per race, but it's bumped up to 34 over the last 3 races. 1.12 points per million, bumped up to 1.36. And then he's gone up 1.4 in the last 3 races. I've discussed this with Adam on the interview I had with him. And we were talking about papaya rules, Piastri versus Leclerc. Like Piastri is going to be in a fully supporting role with Lando Norris as the World Driver Championship comes down to the final 6 races of the season. Is that going to mean that Oscar Piastri is a worse fantasy asset than Charles Leclerc? I'm kind of leaning that way. So he doesn't have like the full endorsement of me. I do have him in my squad right now in my T1 team, but I am pretty tempted to go to Charles Leclerc should Ferrari possibly look really good on the Friday practice session and then sprint qualifying. Important to know for the United States Grand Prix, there is only 1 practice session. Then we go straight into sprint qualifying, and then it's sprint and the Grand Prix qualifying on Saturday. So our lineups will still lock on Saturday like we're used to in F1 fantasy. However, we will have a qualifying session on Friday evening. Another reason that I'm kind of, skeptical about Oscar Piastri's prospects is the fantasy formula curse. So if you saw my episode with Adam, you'll know that we kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'm just going to show you a clip from that episode right now to kind of just show you why I'm a little bit scared of going with Oscar Piastri.
One other thing that I just keep in the back of my mind is that Piastri's completed every racing lap this year. And although drivers like Verstappen last year can finish every lap, it's statistically unlikely that they do. So Rob, I think, famously had this jinx of the Verstappen and Lando Norris heading into Coda. He said this, that you've never had two drivers in the same season complete every lap, and Lando didn't make it, past the first 2 minutes of the race before he was out. So keep an eye on that. If you're a Piastri owner, statistically, his DNF is coming at some point.
I'm going to have to clip this, and then we're going to have a F1 fantasy formula curse on our hands heading into year 3 if Piastri DNFs at Coda. So, yeah, the fantasy formula curse may be living on. So Adam came on, pretty much said, like, he's completed every lap. What's going to happen? And Piastri's last DNF came in the 2023 Austin Sprint last year. So that is definitely something that we have to look out for. Like Adam said, his co-host for the fantasy formula, Rob, last year tweeted out famously, like right before the Las Vegas Grand Prix, that Norris and Verstappen had both completed every lap. That had never happened before. And then boom, like first, 2 laps of the race, Lando DNF. So that is how it went down. So because of all these mitigating factors, I am going to give Oscar Piastri the yellow flag. It's not all because of the curse or whatever's going on there, whatever kind of magic that the fantasy formula has going on over there on their YouTube channel, which is a great one, by the way. You should definitely go check that out. He gets the yellow flag mostly because I think Charles Leclerc might be a more exciting option and can get us more points for Oscar Piastri. McLaren may ask Piastri to sacrifice his race in order for Lando to finish first or second, really try and catch up to Max in the World Drivers' Championship. So that's why Oscar Piastri gets the yellow flag for me heading into the United States Grand Prix. Next up is Lewis Hamilton, 25.1 million. He is now an A-tier asset. Over the last 3 races, he's actually a little bit below his season average, 20.3 points per race. He's also a little bit less value for money, 0.83 points per million, and he's only gone up 0.7 over the last 3 races as well. So he was actually more expensive than Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri heading into the last 3 races, but he has kind of slowed down as Mercedes have kind of taken a dip. Like you can see here, 0 podiums since Spa for Lewis Hamilton, which is a stretch of 5 races, which is not great as we head into the final 6 races of the season. But another interesting trend that I noticed today, thanks to F1fantasytools.com, another fantastic website you should go check out if you are a serious F1 fantasy manager, is Lewis doesn't really do all that well when it comes to sprint weekend. So his results since 2023, and this is in the standings of F1 fantasy points. So Azerbaijan last year, 7th, Austria 6th, Belgium 2nd, so that was good, Qatar 14th, another finish here in Austin 16th, Brazil 10th, China 6th, Miami 8th, and Austria 5th. So it doesn't look all that great. And for someone that is one of the more expensive assets in the game, he's more expensive than Carlos Sainz, more expensive than Sergio Perez, more expensive than George Russell. You're not getting a great form going into another sprint weekend for Lewis Hamilton. Fantastic driver in his own right, but just as a F1 fantasy asset, he's only 0.2 cheaper than Oscar Piastri and Charles Leclerc. And if you can find that 0.2 million, I am begging you to find it and put it into your squad so you can get Oscar Piastri or Charles Leclerc in your team ahead of Lewis Hamilton. And that's why Lewis Hamilton's going to get the red flag for me. Just not really feeling like Mercedes are on the upswing anymore. There was that little stretch right before the summer break where they were looking pretty good. The vibes were great, but Singapore wasn't that great for them either. I'm not entirely sure where the car is going to be. We may come back to Mercedes for Brazil because they do historically do quite well at that track, but Mexico could be tough for them as well. And I just think that Ferrari, Red Bull are bringing huge updates as well. McLaren are going to be really strong here no matter what. I'm not sure if Lewis Hamilton is really the guy you want to spend 25.1 million of your budget on in F1 fantasy. Over to the next team here is Red Bull, 29.3 million. On the season, they're averaging 60.9 points per race, but over the last 3 races, it has dropped drastically down to 37.67 points per million, 2.13. Last 3 races, 1.3. And in general, it's just not been a great second half of the year for Red Bull. They have been in the top two scoring constructors or the top scoring constructor in 2 of the last 12 races, which is not great at all. Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren have all had their fair share of firsts over that time period. So Red Bulls is the most expensive constructor, one of the most expensive, the second most expensive asset in the game. 2.8 more than McLaren, 4.6 more than Ferrari, and 5.3 more than Mercedes. And what I was just talking about, Lewis Hamilton, if you can find that 0.2 million, find it. So if you have Red Bull in your squad, which is unlikely, I'm going to admit, like most engaged managers are on the McLaren, Ferrari, or if the budget's not that good, the McLaren, Mercedes kind of build there. But Red Bull, you can really find a lot of money if you get rid of them or if you don't try to go to them. I know there's been like a little groundswell of like how big their update is going to be for the United States Grand Prix, and they should do quite well here. However, if you just look over the next 6 races, like you can see, last 12 races to be the top scoring constructor in twice in the last 12 races. It's not a great track record. So I'm going to go over the last 12 races compared to the next 6 of hoping that Red Bull, it is a fantastic differential. Like if you have a really big budget and you can kind of get there and you're feeling good, that FP1 looks like pretty decent in the data, I really don't mind going over to Red Bull as a differential play. Like if you're way down in your mini league and you just know that the guy at top is going to stick with Mercedes or McLaren and Ferrari or Mercedes for the rest of the season, and you're just like, well, it's first or last, Ricky Bobby style, Red Bull is a fine play. However, if you're just kind of fighting for overall rank, you're trying to get into whatever kind of target you set yourself for the rest of the F1 fantasy season, Red Bull does not feel like a great option to me. So they're going to get the red flag. It's pretty obvious they're second most expensive asset in the game. However, just in case you were thinking about going there, I don't think that we can trust them, because you also have to trust Checo Perez when you go with the Red Bull as the constructor, and still not sure. Like if the updates are going to bring the car more towards Max, where he has like historically thrived. Checo has struggled when Red Bull brings the car more towards Max traditionally, and that's when Perez really gets in trouble. Like at the start of the season, he does all right, and then when they bring updates, the car kind of gets away from Checo and he does worse. So if this new update that Red Bull is bringing is to get the car back towards Max the way he likes to drive, that could be spell bad news for Checo Perez, and then in turn bad news for Red Bull. Moving over to the final 2 drivers here, Liam Lawson, the kind of talk of the F1 fantasy paddock, 10.2 million he came in at. Last season, he had 5 races for AlphaTauri when Daniel Ricciardo broke his hand. He averaged 4.2 points per race. He was worth 1.0 points per million, and he did not change. However, that doesn't tell the whole story, because he was pretty dang fantastic for the first 4 races when he was with AlphaTauri. He averaged 9.2 points per race in the final, up until the final race of his 2023 season, where he had a DNF in the sprint in Qatar. And he's making his debut. It's much hyped. The car hasn't been that great recently for VCarb. I was talking about this with Adam as well in the interview, like how we kind of thought that like they were going to get all the RB19 parts slapped on their car and they were going to be great for the F1 fantasy season, the new Aston Martin of 2024, but it has not been that way. And this is kind of feels like a fight for that Red Bull seat next season. I'm not entirely sure if Red Bull even want Yuki Tsunoda in there, but they kind of just want to see Liam Lawson. Can they promote him up to that second Red Bull seat behind Max Verstappen for the 2025 season? However, to bring him in is quite a difficult price point for those of us in like the sub 125, 126 million bracket, because most of us are running the triple back markers with Valtteri Bottas, Zhou Guanyu, and Franco Colapinto. We will get to it a little bit here. And that leaves us with just enough money for Lando Norris and then like an Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, along with McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes, whatever combination of those. So if your budget is a little bit more than that, you can get to Liam Lawson. However, that kind of puts you in the range of like a Nico Hülkenberg, who's had a pretty good track record all season. And I'm just not sure. The problem is Liam Lawson is going to have a grid penalty is rumored to have a grid penalty for the sprint race in Austin. And that should raise his floor in F1 fantasy. He could probably get some cheap overtakes on the Saubers, possibly the Williams if they're struggling. We'll just see how it goes there. So we'll see how Lawson looks in FP1 and the sprint qualifying. And then we'll get enough data and then be like, okay, looks pretty rapid, looks pretty good. The car's looking strong. And he could be brought in for those teams that have a little bit of a bigger budget. My T3 team has about 132-ish 0.7 million, I think. And he's definitely an option for me. I can upgrade Alexander Albon to Liam Lawson. And with Albon's recent struggles, just 4 DNFs this season, not great for him. Lawson kind of taking on a new engine. Car should be pretty speedy. We'll see how it all looks. But Lawson is definitely an upgrade option for Alexander Albon for me in that T3 squad. So for that reason, he's getting the yellow flag, mostly because it's like a budget game here with Liam Lawson. So if you can get to him when you have the budget, I think he's probably a pretty nice add. He's also going to be a differential because for those of us like myself with my T1 team that's sub 125 million, there's just really not any way I can get to Liam Lawson unless I sacrifice like Charles Leclerc or Oscar Piastri down to George Russell and then bring like a Joe Guan Yu or Valtteri Bottas all the way up to Liam Lawson. But I don't think those points are going to be that significant that it's going to be worth 2 transfers. So Liam Lawson gets the yellow flag. If you got the budget, I really don't mind it. Differential play. He's not going to be highly owned in the game. But if you do have that, like I'm saying, 124.7 million, that's right below me right now, I just don't think he's going to be worth the price difference to get from like the downgrade that you're going to have in the rest of your squad. Final guy here is the man who has captured our hearts in F1 fantasy, Franco Colapinto, 6.3 million. Biggest price rise in the last 3 races. He's actually the 9th highest scoring driver over the last 3 races as well. 8.67 points per race. That's ahead of Sergio Perez, Lance Stroll, Kevin Magnussen, another price rise darling of the F1 fantasy community. But yeah, being ahead of Perez is pretty spicy, I would say. And he is kind of dominating Alexander Albon over the last 3 races here. So in the columns here, you can see head-to-head points per race. Albon's rocking 0.67, Colapinto 8.67, points per million. Alexander Albon 0.1, Colapinto 1.67, and then price change. Albon's gone up 0.3, and Colapinto's gone up 1.5. Can this continue? I don't know, but he is the cheapest asset on the grid right now, and he is just kind of like that overtake in turn 1 in Singapore was inspiring. Just kind of has a little bit of no fear. We'll see if the fall break has slightly halted that momentum. I feel like if the races just kept coming at a more like consistent pace, like Colapinto just wouldn't have time to kind of take a breath. He would just keep going. But it could also be the other way where he had 3 races for the first 3 F1 races of his career in pretty quick consecutive fashion there. And maybe he did need the breather. Otherwise, he would have like maybe hit like a rookie wall. He was talking to, I believe, in the weekend warm-up before Singapore, Laura Winter was talking about how she saw him at the airport and he was like, I'm exhausted. So like maybe the break will have done well for the young Argentinian driver. 6.3 million. If you need those savings, like I was talking about, like if you've had a little bit of a bigger budget but you have like a slightly differently constructed team where it's like you've got Max Verstappen and George Russell and that kind of stuff. And you just need some money to get from George Russell up to like a Lando Norris and a Charles Leclerc pairing. You can downgrade Max, you can upgrade George, and just bring in like a Franco Colapinto at 6.3 million or like another more expensive driver. Like I would much rather have Franco Colapinto than Alexander Albon, possibly for the remainder of the season. The Williams, I think they're trying to build some momentum into 2025 when Carlos Sainz comes aboard. But Franco Colapinto is also driving potentially for that final seat at Sauber. At the time of recording, nothing has been like made official of that. So if that changes between now and when this is published, my bad on that one. But yeah, Franco Colapinto, 6.3 million. Most 1.5 million he's gone up over the last 3 races. So he's rising in budget. I don't think he's going to go down. He's going to have a pretty disastrous weekend for him to kind of fall below that, especially with the sprint weekend. You know, he's been battling for that top 10 spot since he came in. So sprint only awards points for the first 8, that's another podcast altogether. but I think Colapinto can kind of come through here and get us another price rise, get up to 6.8 million, and really like start to be like right behind those assets at Sauber, who have just been kind of ticking along, dropping, slightly rising for pretty much the entire season. So Colapinto gets the green flag for me. One green flag in this week's episode of Green Flag, Yellow Flag, Red Flag, and it belongs to Franco Colapinto. But that will do it for this week's episode of Green Flag, Yellow Flag, Red Flag. I'll have one again for the Mexico Grand Prix that's coming up next week. I have one more episode this week that is going to be the big Grand Prix preview, along with my kind of final-ish team selection before we get any racing on the track. But like I said, we've had some fall break content coming out of the F1 Fantasy Pole Position YouTube channel with a late season chip strategy episode, an interview with Adam, the early team selection. So plenty to look out for and just kind of watch while we are waiting for the tires to hit the track in Austin, Texas. But once again, you can follow me on X at F1UNFPL. Like the video, give me a comment, let me know what you're thinking ahead of the United States Grand Prix. And once again, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you next time.